Chris.
Give it time, Mr. Chair. Give it time. I've only been here a little while. Mr. Chair, I'm very happy to talk about the purpose clause and clause 4A of this particular bill. The purpose of this Act is to uphold students' rights to freedom of association by removing any requirement for students to join students' associations. And there's a huge amount of material. This is where we get down to the guts of whether or not, in fact, this bill is desirable. First of all, Mr. Chair, the question becomes, under the purpose clause, is this actually required? Is this actually necessary? The purpose is to uphold a student's right to freedom of association. Well, first of all, let's look at whether or not the provisions in the current Act infringe on a student's right to freedom of association. And I'd put forward a pretty compelling case that, in fact, they don't. That they don't compel students to associate, and that actually you could mount quite a convincing case, and I'm sure one of my colleagues will do so further down the track, that in fact being a member of a wider collective body such as a students' association doesn't actually infringe, even if you have to be a member, doesn't infringe on a student's right to a freedom of association, in much the same way that the compulsion for me to pay taxes to the government does not infringe on my rights to freedom of association either. And I think that's an argument that we will address as we get further down the track. But the question that I want to turn my attention to, particularly at the moment, is whether or not students have no other option than to join a students' association as the law currently stands. And there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that is the case. In fact, it is definitely not the case. Under the law passed by the then national government in the late 1990s, stewarded through the House by Tau Henare, who was at the time a member of New Zealand First, and with the support of people such as Deborah Morris. Under that law, in order for there to be universal membership of a students' association, all of the students at that institution have to participate in a vote to say that they do want there to be universal membership of a students' association, and that those votes took place. They took place in the beginning of 1999, and only two institutions of the universities, only two institutions opted for voluntary membership through those. The Waikato Student Union, who were already voluntary, and subsequently in a future referendum opted to go back to a universal system of membership, and the Auckland University Students' Association. So those were the two voluntary ones. All of the other universities, and we'll talk about polytechs and institutes of technology shortly, but all of those university institutions, all of the students there voted in quite large numbers to retain a universal system of membership. At Victoria University, where I was a student at the time, it was about, I think it was from memory, 78% of those who voted in the referendum voted to retain a universal system of membership. Now, one of the arguments put forward by those in favour of voluntary membership is that those who vote in students' association-related activities are a small number and aren't representative of the wider student population. In fact, in that referendum, more than half of all of the students who were enrolled at Victoria University voted in that referendum on whether or not there should be a universal system of membership for the associations, and 78% of them voted in favour of having that. Now, there is a provision within the Act that if the students become dissatisfied with their association, with having a universal system of membership, they can call another referendum and they can make the membership voluntary. They have that ability at the moment. Now, having watched the Victoria University Students' Association in the last 3 or 4 years, I think there are probably a few instances where they may well have been, many students may have felt compelled to call such a referendum, because I don't think the behaviour of some of the elected representatives in the Victoria University Students' Association in the last few years has been particularly acceptable. And actually, I think one of the disciplines that the referendum option puts on students' associations is if they do become unresponsive to their members, if they lose touch with what their members are wanting, then they know that the members can take away their ability to continue to levy them, and they can remove that universal membership provision. That's already there under the current Act. And it was an Act passed by a national government. And that was the National Party's position going into the last election, that they would not change it. Paul Hutchison went around the country and said they would not change this legislation. It's another broken promise from the National Party, a bit like their promise not to increase the GST. They promised they weren't going to touch this legislation, but they've bowed to the pressure from the ACT Party to do just that. So that's the second point that I want to raise. The third point, Mr. Chair, the third point that I want to raise is, given all of those arguments, whether or not, if there is a universal system of membership at a students' association, whether there is an ability to opt out. So if a student feels so strongly offended by the notion that they are associated with this with the students' association at their institution, Polytech, University or otherwise, they can opt out. Can they opt out? Under the current law, yes, they can opt out. So to say that the current law infringes their rights to freedom of association simply isn't true. A student can opt out now. I would say to Heather Roy, the member in charge, I think those provisions could actually be strengthened. I think that there is a legitimate cause to say that under the old law that existed before the current law, it was almost impossible to opt out of a students' association, and one of the changes that happened in the late 1990s was that the provisions were strengthened somewhat. I think they could actually be strengthened a little bit more without going the whole hog to having totally voluntary student membership, because I think in some cases students clearly don't want to be a member of an association and they could opt out. I think the difficulty that I have with this bill is it goes all the way to the other extent where it makes it almost impossible to have a large-scale students' association at a tertiary institution that is largely reflective of the membership of the composition of the students at that institution. And I think that a students' association without that ability to claim representative status will have all of the good work that they do eroded. And there's so many things that students' associations do that simply don't get noticed that they won't be able to do under a voluntary regime. Now, I know another one of the arguments put forward by the proponents of voluntary membership is that students' associations, particularly when they are involved in activism on political issues, the VSM advocates, typically they would come from a right-wing perspective, whereas a students' association would be arguing on the old-fashioned terms, or a more progressive left-wing perspective. They would say, well, the students' association doesn't represent me, so why should I therefore have to join that association? I think that's a red herring of an argument, Mr. Chair, because first of all, they can participate in the process. So they can get themselves elected to the Students' Association executive, and they could change the policy of the Students' Association. Students' associations actually do operate on a very democratic basis. Not hard to call a general meeting, not hard to get elected to a Students' Association executive. I managed to do it 4 times. So I know, so it's not hard to do it. Of course, the candidates who put forward that argument about they don't agree with the politics of the Students' Association, they never managed to get themselves elected. Because the students largely do actually believe in the position that's put forward by the Students' Association. It is a position that is supported by the majority of students at the institutions, and that's reflected in the fact that they vote for the executive and they vote for people who espouse those views. We actually did surveys when I was the president of the Victoria University Students' Association to get students' views on things. And we're not talking about small-scale surveys, I'm talking about large chunks of the campus population to make sure that the views we were putting forward on their behalf actually represented what they thought, and overwhelmingly they favoured the arguments that we put forward around lower cost, access to education and so on. Now, of course, we know the national government don't like the arguments put forward by many students' associations because they made all these promises up and down the country that they don't intend to keep. I remember a very famous promise that students' associations have continued to remind this government about, the promise made by the then National Party spokesperson for education to abolish student fees altogether. And that was made in 1990 by the National Party's education spokesperson, the Honourable Dr Lockwood Smith, who went up and down the country, signed his name on those pledges at every students' association in the country. It was the students' associations that got him to pledge to do that, and the students' associations that continue to remind him time and time again that he broke that promise, and in fact they're now paying much, much higher fees increasingly every year. So the students' associations have played an important role in keeping governments honest, of both Labor and national governments. I was the president of the Students' Association at Victoria University when the last Labor government was first elected into office, and it would be fair to say I think we did a little bit to try and keep that government honest and to push for policies that advanced student interests further than the government may have been willing to go. Good for us that the previous Labor government respected the position of students' associations, even though they didn't necessarily agree with what we were arguing for, unlike the current national government, who would rather do away with students' associations altogether, rather than actually listen to the position that they are putting forward on behalf of their members.
Gareth